It is just past 2 in the morning on the 7th of May, 1945, and in a red brick technical college in the French city of Reims, a war is ending in almost total silence. There are no crowds outside, no church bells, no searchlights sweeping the sky in celebration. Instead, there is a cramped, map-lined classroom, perhaps 9 meters square, its walls covered in colored pins tracking the collapse of an empire that once stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Stalingrad. A handful of Allied officers sit at a plain wooden table. Opposite them stands a German colonel general named Alfred Jodl, chief of staff to the man who now calls himself head of state of Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Jodl's face is pale and fixed. Around the room, a small number of war correspondents and photographers wait, tense, aware that they are witnessing something enormous, and equally aware that they have been ordered, on pain of losing their accreditation, to say nothing about it for the next 36 hours. Jodl signs. It takes 5 minutes. 4 copies of the document pass along the table. A separate naval order is signed by a British admiral. And with a handful of pen strokes, in a room that looks more like a geography classroom than the setting for the end of the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War in Europe is, on paper at least, over. Outside, Reims sleeps on, unaware. There has been no advance warning to the townspeople, no crowds gathering along the boulevards, nothing to mark this out from any other cold, damp night in liberated France. Inside the building, the atmosphere is closer to that of a solicitor's office finalizing an unpleasant piece of business than a scene from the history books. A small group of accredited war correspondents lean against the back wall, forbidden from writing a single word about what they are watching for the next day and a half. Somewhere behind them, a single newsreel cameraman, one of only a handful permitted through the door, adjusts the angle of a boxy hand-cranked camera, uncertain, in truth, of exactly how much usable footage his few precious rolls of film will actually capture in the poor light of an overhead bulb. Except it is not quite over. Not yet. And the story of what happened to the visual record of that moment and of the second, far grander ceremony staged less than 48 hours later in a ruined Berlin suburb is one of the strangest footnotes of the entire war. It is a story about 2 surrenders instead of 1. About a news blackout that collapsed within hours because a single American reporter refused to sit on the biggest story of his career, and about miles of newsreel film that would spend the best part of half a century sitting behind the Iron Curtain, largely unseen by Western audiences. Its context quietly rewritten by both sides of an emerging Cold War for reasons that had very little to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with politics. This is the story of why the footage of Germany's surrender was never quite what it appeared to be, why there were 2 ceremonies where the public imagination generally allows for one, and why the true record of those extraordinary hours only came into full view decades after the guns fell silent. It matters because it shows in miniature how history is filmed, censored, restaged, and only slowly released back to the people who lived through it. The war ended twice. The cameras were only fully rolling for one of those endings, and for years afterwards, almost nobody in the West was allowed to see the other one properly at all. By the spring of 1945, the Allied High Command faced a problem that had nothing to do with tanks or artillery, and everything to do with paperwork, propaganda, and trust. Germany was disintegrating from within. Adolf Hitler had killed himself in his Berlin bunker on the 30th of April, and authority, such as it was, had passed to Grand Admiral Dönitz, operating out of the northern town of Flensburg, with a government that no Allied power formally recognized. Yet Dönitz still commanded in theory several million men under arms across a fractured front stretching from Norway to Czechoslovakia. The problem was not persuading Germany that it had lost. That much was obvious to almost everyone except the most fanatical remnants of the regime. The problem was persuading Germany's scattered military commanders to stop fighting the Soviets specifically, while continuing to surrender freely to the British and Americans. This was not a small distinction. Between the 1st and 7th of May, a patchwork of partial surrenders had already taken place. German forces in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and in northwest Germany had each laid down their arms in separate ceremonies, often negotiated locally and signed in isolation from any single unifying document. Meanwhile, in the East, Dönitz was doing precisely what military historians would later confirm he intended all along, ordering his forces to fight on against the Red Army for as long as possible, buying time for as many German soldiers and civilians as could manage it to flee westward and surrender to British or American troops rather than face Soviet captivity. Estimates of how many people made that desperate westward journey in the final days of the war vary, but it numbered in the hundreds of thousands, driven by the entirely justified fear of what awaited them in Soviet hands after 4 years of a war of annihilation on the Eastern Front. For Dwight Eisenhower and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, this created an almost impossible diplomatic tightrope. A single, simultaneous, unconditional surrender was needed, one that bound every German force on every front to stop fighting at the same moment, witnessed and accepted by all 4 major Allied powers together. Anything less risked exactly what Stalin most feared: the suspicion that the Western Allies were quietly permitting a separate peace in the West while leaving the Soviet Union to fight on alone in the East at continued and appalling cost. Soviet forces had, after all, absorbed the overwhelming majority of German military casualties across the war. Any hint that the war's ending was being managed to Soviet disadvantage threatened to poison the alliance at the very moment victory was within reach. There was a second, quieter problem, and it concerned authority rather than diplomacy. When German representatives finally arrived at Reims to negotiate terms, the senior Soviet officer available to witness proceedings was a liaison general named Ivan Susloparov, and it was not entirely clear, even to the Soviets themselves, whether Susloparov had been given the authority from Moscow to sign a document of this magnitude on the Soviet Union's behalf. Stalin, when informed of what had taken place at Reims, was furious for reasons that went well beyond bureaucratic tidiness. He wanted the German High Command itself, not a mid-ranking chief of staff, brought to heel. He wanted it done in Berlin, the very capital from which German aggression had been launched, not in a French provincial town. And he wanted the ceremony conducted with the full pomp of Soviet military triumph, witnessed by Soviet marshals rather than liaison officers. So the Reims signing, however historic, would not be allowed to stand alone as the definitive account of Germany's defeat. A second ceremony was already being arranged before the ink at Reims had properly dried, and the question of how, and how completely, either event would actually be recorded for posterity was about to become considerably more complicated than anyone in that Reims classroom could have anticipated. By early May, the scale of the collapse made the need for absolute clarity more urgent by the day. German forces in Italy had already surrendered on the 2nd of May. Forces in northwest Germany, Holland, and Denmark had laid down their arms to Field Marshal Montgomery on the 4th. The German Navy had ceased operations on the 5th, on Dönitz's own order. Each of these local surrenders was a genuine military event, but none of them, on its own, closed the war, and each one signed in isolation risked creating exactly the kind of patchwork, contested ending that both Eisenhower and Stalin were determined to avoid. It was against this backdrop of accumulating partial endings, each one needing to be folded into a single, unarguable document, that the pressure to arrange one final, comprehensive signing at Reims became unavoidable. There was, underlying all of this, a much older problem that the surrender was meant to solve once and for all: the bitter memory of 1918. German nationalist politics between the wars had been built, in no small part, on the myth that the Kaiser's army had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, but had instead been stabbed in the back by politicians who signed an armistice while German troops still stood on foreign soil. Eisenhower and his political masters in London and Washington were acutely conscious of the danger of allowing anything comparable to take root after this war. That is precisely why the surrender terms insisted not merely on a ceasefire, but on the total, unconditional capitulation of every German armed force everywhere, signed by senior military figures in person, with no ambiguity left for a future demagogue to exploit. A clean, unambiguous, thoroughly documented ending was not a diplomatic nicety. It was considered essential to preventing a repeat of the previous war's aftermath, and that is a large part of why getting the filmed and photographed record right, or at least right enough to be believed, mattered so much to everyone involved. The technical apparatus for recording the surrender was, in the end, remarkably modest given the scale of what it was documenting. Newsreel cameramen of the period typically worked with hand-cranked or spring-driven 35mm cameras such as the Bell & Howell IMO, a compact, boxy unit that a single operator could carry on his shoulder, roughly the size and weight of a large car battery, capable of a burst of unassisted filming lasting perhaps 30 seconds before needing to be rewound. Still photographers worked alongside them with plate and roll film cameras, their flashbulbs the only source of supplementary light in rooms lit mainly by weak overhead bulbs and the gray daylight through tall classroom windows. At Reims, access was tightly restricted. Schaef permitted a small pool of accredited correspondents and photographers into the signing room itself, understanding that whatever was captured there would need to be processed, censored, and cleared by military authorities before a single frame reached the public. This was standard practice throughout the war. Exposed newsreel film from any front was gathered by combat cameramen and sent back through military channels for review, a process that, even at the best of times, could take weeks. Reporters present at Reims were placed under strict embargo, told that nothing, not a word, not a photograph, could be released for 36 hours, ostensibly to allow time for the second, ratifying ceremony in Berlin to take place and for all the Allied governments to make simultaneous announcements. It was at Karlshorst, in the Berlin suburb chosen by the Soviets as the site of the second signing, that the visual record became genuinely chaotic. The building selected was a former German Army engineering school, its grand hall pressed into service as a ceremonial chamber, tables draped in cloth arranged in a horseshoe before a long table for the assembled Allied commanders. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the conqueror of Berlin, would preside in person, flanked by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, representing Eisenhower, American General Karl Spaatz, and French General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. The German delegation this time would be led not by Chief of Staff but by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the entire German armed forces, flown in specifically because the Soviets had insisted that only signatories of genuinely senior rank would be acceptable. Eyewitness accounts of the Karlshorst ceremony describe a press pack, overwhelmingly Soviet, that simply could not be controlled. According to one British correspondent present that night, photographers surged forward until they all but engulfed the top table, pushing and jostling to force their cameras within inches of Keitel's face as he signed, climbing onto chairs and shoving each other off them to get a clearer shot. It was, by any normal standard of ceremonial military protocol, a shambles, and it is precisely this disorder that makes the surviving footage from Karlshorst so visually different in character from the comparatively sedate, tightly controlled images that came out of Reims 2 days earlier. Even a small human detail speaks to how improvised the whole affair was. When the moment came for the witnessing generals to add their signatures, nobody could immediately produce a working pen, a delay of a few minutes in an otherwise meticulously choreographed piece of political theater. The physical building at Karlshorst had itself been chosen with theater in mind rather than convenience. It had served, until days earlier, as officers' quarters and a canteen for a German Army engineering school, and it needed a considerable amount of hasty rearranging to double as a setting grand enough for what the Soviets intended to be remembered as the true and final capitulation of Nazi Germany. Long tables were pushed together and draped in cloth borrowed in some accounts from nearby requisitioned buildings. The flags of the 4 Allied powers were hung at the head of the room, and outside on the tarmac at Tempelhof Airfield, a military band had been assembled to greet the arriving delegations, its music competing with the noise of fighter aircraft warming their engines nearby, the wreckage of the Luftwaffe's last stand still visible in piles at the edges of the field. None of this grandeur was accidental. Every element of the staging, the band, the flags, the insistence on Zhukov's personal presence rather than a subordinate's, was designed with an eye on how the resulting photographs and film would read to audiences back home and to history. Production and distribution of the resulting film followed the standard wartime newsreel pipeline, now straining under an embargo that both the American and Soviet authorities badly wanted to hold. Once developed, footage from both ceremonies would ordinarily have been distributed to newsreel companies such as Pathé in Britain and to United News and its rivals in America for editing into the short, narrated reels shown in cinemas before the main feature. Exact figures for how many complete prints of the Karlshorst footage were struck in the immediate aftermath are not something the historical record allows us to state with confidence. Official production numbers for specific reels from this period were rarely published, and much of what survives has been reconstructed by archivists piecing together fragments held by the Bundesarchiv, the Imperial War Museum, and Soviet, later Russian, state film archives. To understand why this process was so slow and so easily disrupted, it helps to picture the physical chain a single reel of exposed film had to travel. A cameraman's spent roll, perhaps no more than 3 or 4 minutes of usable footage in total once bad takes and reloading gaps were accounted for, first had to be flown or driven under guard to a processing laboratory, commonly in London or Paris, where it was developed, printed, and screened by military censors before a single frame was cleared for civilian release. Censors were looking for 2 things above all: any image that might reveal genuinely sensitive military detail, of which there was almost none in a signing ceremony, and, just as importantly in this case, anything that might undercut the carefully agreed diplomatic choreography between the Allies. A shot of a smirking Soviet liaison officer or a German delegate looking too composed rather than suitably humbled might be trimmed not for security reasons but simply because it told the wrong emotional story. Only once a print had cleared this review did it travel onward to the newsreel companies for editing into a finished item with narration, music, and title cards, a process that could easily add several more days before anything reached a cinema screen, by which point, at Reims at least, the embargo had already collapsed and the news itself was old. The embargo lasted barely a day. On the afternoon of the 7th of May, Associated Press correspondent Edward Kennedy, who had witnessed the Reims signing and had been told by Schaeff that a German radio broadcast confirming the surrender had already gone out publicly, decided that a story of this magnitude, one already effectively public knowledge in Germany, could not reasonably be kept from readers in the democracies that had just won the war. He filed his report by transatlantic telephone, and it broke worldwide within hours, triggering spontaneous celebrations across Britain, America, and liberated Europe on the 7th and into the 8th of May, well before the second, official, ceremony in Berlin had even taken place. Kennedy's decision effectively ended his career with the wire services. He was formally denounced by his fellow correspondents and dropped by the Associated Press. But it also meant that by the time cameramen were setting up their tripods in the Grand Hall at Karlshorst on the night of the 8th, the war was already, in the public mind of the Western world, over, and the ceremony they were filming had become, in an important psychological sense, an afterthought. For Eisenhower's headquarters, the timing could hardly have been more awkward. Schaeff had wanted a single, simultaneous announcement across all the Allied capitals, carefully synchronized with the Berlin signing, so that no one nation's press could claim to have broken the story first, and no one Allied government could appear to have been caught unprepared. Kennedy's leak shattered that plan within hours, and it left Western leaders scrambling to deliver formal victory broadcasts to their own populations, who were already celebrating in the streets before the second ceremony in Berlin had even begun. Winston Churchill's own announcement to the British public and the mass celebrations in London that followed it were technically running slightly ahead of the actual completion of the surrender process, a fact rarely dwelt upon in the popular memory of VE Day, but very much a live concern for the diplomats and generals trying to manage the story in real time. What audiences at home eventually saw, when the newsreels did reach cinema screens, was therefore something curiously flattened. British viewers watching a Pathé reel saw solemn officers signing papers in 2 different rooms, in 2 different countries, on what was represented as more or less the same occasion, with commentary that smoothed over the confusion of dates, the argument over authority, and the sheer bad temper that had characterized the diplomatic run-up to both signings. Soviet audiences, watching newsreels compiled by their own studios, saw something rather different in emphasis. A triumphant Zhukov, presiding in Berlin itself, receiving the unconditional capitulation of the entire Wehrmacht in the ruined capital of the regime that had invaded their homeland. A ceremony deliberately staged with more grandeur than Reims precisely, so that it could be presented as the true and definitive surrender, the earlier signing dismissed in Soviet accounts as a mere preliminary that Moscow had never fully recognized. This divergence in how the same fundamental event was filmed, narrated, and released to the public did not end when the war did. It hardened over the following 4 decades into something closer to 2 separate historical memories, kept apart by the very geography the surrender itself had created. The building at Karlshorst where Keitel signed away what remained of the German war effort fell, almost immediately, inside the Soviet zone of occupied Berlin. Within a few years, it had become the headquarters of the Soviet military administration in Germany, and by the late 1940s, with the founding of the German Democratic Republic, it was converted into a museum commemorating what East German and Soviet authorities called the Great Patriotic War. For the following 40 years, that museum, and by extension the physical room and much of the surrounding archive of photographs and film connected to the signing, sat behind the Iron Curtain, accessible chiefly to visitors from the Eastern Bloc, its exhibits presented with a heavy Soviet political framing that emphasized Red Army sacrifice and downplayed the contribution, and indeed the parallel ceremony, of the Western Allies. Even some of the museum's own set dressing turned out, decades later, to be reconstruction rather than original artifact. The flags and furniture long displayed as the authentic 1945 fittings were, according to the museum's own later revisions of its exhibition text, largely recreated in 1967 for the GDR's original version of the display, not preserved intact from the night itself. It is worth being honest here about the limits of what can be said with certainty. There is no single, dramatic document that historians point to as proof that the Karlshorst footage was deliberately classified in the way that a piece of sensitive military intelligence might be. What kept it from Western eyes for so long was something more mundane and, in some ways, more revealing, an ordinary combination of geography, occupation politics, and archival neglect. The film sat in archives controlled by a government the West had no diplomatic access to, in a museum whose entire purpose was to tell a Soviet story rather than a shared one, in a city physically divided by a wall from 1961 onwards. Nobody needed to stamp the reels secret for them to remain, in practice, almost entirely unseen outside the Eastern Bloc for the better part of 40 years. For Western researchers, filmmakers, and ordinary curious members of the public, this meant that the fullest visual record of the war's actual, final, formally recognized end sat largely out of reach for the entire Cold War. Documentary makers in Britain and America working on the history of VE Day naturally gravitated towards the Reims material, better cataloged, more accessible, and more comfortably fitting a Western narrative in which Eisenhower's headquarters played the central role. The Karlshorst footage existed, was known to exist, and was occasionally glimpsed in fragments smuggled out through diplomatic or academic channels. But it was not until German reunification in 1990 and the gradual opening of former Soviet and East German archives through that decade and into the next that anything approaching the full film record became genuinely available for international researchers to examine, catalog, and, crucially, license for use in Western documentaries. The museum itself was not substantially reopened with full trilingual English language interpretation until 2013, an extraordinary 68 years after the event it commemorates. If you are finding the strange double life of this footage as interesting as I do, this is usually the point where I would ask you to consider subscribing, because stories like this one, about the small, human, often accidental decisions that shaped how we remember enormous historical moments, are exactly what this channel tries to dig up. It costs nothing and it helps far more than you might expect, so if you have got this far, a quick subscribe would genuinely be appreciated before we carry on. There is one more piece of the puzzle worth setting out before we move on to how each side chose to present its own version of events, because it explains just how differently the two governments treated the raw material once it was in their hands. In the West, the Reims and Karlshorst reels, once cleared by military censors, passed relatively quickly into ordinary commercial newsreel circulation, subject to the same editorial trimming and narration as any other wartime story, but not to any special, long-term secrecy once the war itself had ended. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, film of this significance remained the property of the state in a much more enduring sense, held within state film archives that were simply not open to outside researchers, Soviet or foreign, without specific official permission that was rarely granted for material touching on the precise sequence of the war's end. It is that second, more institutional form of control, rather than any single dramatic act of suppression, that did the most to keep the fuller picture out of Western view for so long. It is worth pausing on how differently the two ceremonies were treated by their respective press machines at the time, because the contrast tells you almost everything about how each side wanted the ending of the war to be remembered. American and British newsreel coverage, freed by Kennedy's leak, leaned heavily into Reims, a comparatively small, business-like ceremony conducted swiftly by professional soldiers in a schoolroom, fitting neatly into a Western self-image of efficient, unfussy military competence. The Karlshorst footage that did make it to Western screens was typically presented as confirmation rather than climax, a formality that ratified what had already, in the public's understanding, been settled 2 days earlier in France. Soviet coverage inverted that emphasis entirely. State newsreels built around the Berlin signing framed it as the true and only surrender that mattered, staged with far greater ceremonial weight, complete with military bands at Tempelhof Airfield, honor guards, and Zhukov himself presiding rather than a delegated subordinate. Reims, in Soviet accounts, was consistently described as an unauthorized, unratified preliminary, of interest chiefly because it showed the Western Allies attempting to claim credit for an ending that could only properly be sealed on German soil, in the capital city, before the commander who had actually taken Berlin. This is also, incidentally, why the two sides of the former Iron Curtain still mark the end of the war on different days, the 8th of May in the West, the 9th in Russia and much of the former Soviet space, a discrepancy created almost entirely by the time difference between Berlin and Moscow at the moment the Karlshorst document was formally signed just after midnight. There is no equivalent story of a hidden or suppressed American surrender ceremony to compare this against, because there was, in the strictest sense, only ever one German surrender process split across these two signings. But it is instructive to note how the same institutional habits, embargoes, controlled access, selective release that shaped Western and Soviet handling of Reims and Karlshorst would recur in different forms throughout the Cold War whenever either side controlled the physical film record of a politically sensitive event. What made the surrender footage unusual was that both halves of the story were, for decades, effectively hidden from part of the audience. The West rarely saw Karlshorst in full, uncut context, and the Soviet public was given a version of Reims stripped of the very real drama of Kennedy's leak and the diplomatic scrambling it caused. It is also worth comparing this to how Germany's earlier partial surrenders in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Denmark were handled on film, because the contrast is instructive. Those local ceremonies, negotiated by field commanders without the same level of political stakes attached, were filmed with comparatively little fuss and released to the public within days, since neither Washington nor Moscow had any particular reason to control how they were remembered. It was only once a ceremony touched the question of who, precisely, had won the war and on whose terms, Rams implicitly crediting Eisenhower's headquarters, Karlshorst implicitly crediting the Red Army's capture of Berlin, that the handling of the film record became this careful, this contested, and ultimately this slow to reach a genuinely shared international audience. The technology of recording had not changed between a minor regional surrender in the Netherlands and the grand ceremony at Karlshorst. What changed was how much each side cared about controlling the story the camera told. Assessing the actual historical impact of this fractured, delayed release of the surrender footage requires a certain amount of honesty about what can and cannot be known. It did not change the outcome of the war, obviously. The fighting had already stopped by the time either reel reached a cinema screen. Its impact was almost entirely on memory and interpretation, rather than on events themselves. For decades, Western popular understanding of VE Day centered overwhelmingly on Reims and on Eisenhower's headquarters, with Karlshorst reduced, in many general histories and school textbooks, to a brief footnote about a second formal signing in Berlin. Its drama, its chaos, its staged grandeur, largely invisible to anyone who had not specifically sought out specialist archival material or visited the museum itself behind the Berlin Wall. The psychological effect on contemporary audiences in 1945 was, by contrast, immediate and overwhelming, even without full access to every frame of film. The news that the war in Europe had ended produced spontaneous near-universal celebration across the Allied world within hours of Kennedy's report breaking, regardless of which ceremony people actually understood themselves to be celebrating. In that sense, the footage itself was almost beside the point in May 1945. It was the fact of surrender, communicated however imperfectly and however far ahead of the official timetable, that mattered to the people dancing in the streets of London and New York. It is also worth acknowledging what remains genuinely uncertain about this story, rather than smoothing over the gaps for the sake of a tidier narrative. Precisely how much film was shot at each ceremony, how many individual takes were spoiled by the crush of photographers at Karlshorst, and what became of any rejected or censored footage from either signing, are questions that surviving records do not answer with any real precision. Some material was almost certainly lost or junked in the ordinary churn of wartime archives, as vast quantities of newsreel footage from this period were, long before anyone thought to treat it as historically precious rather than simply last week's news. What survives today in London, in Berlin, and in Moscow should therefore be understood as a partial record, assembled from whatever happened to be kept, rather than a complete and continuous account of everything the cameras in either room actually captured that week. The longer-term legacy lies more in what the episode reveals about the machinery of wartime and early Cold War information control than in any single dramatic revelation contained within the footage itself. It became, for later historians and documentary makers, a useful case study in how access to film archives can itself become a political tool, how a museum's exhibition choices can shape public memory as powerfully as the original event, and how the physical location of an archive, on one side or the other of a hardening ideological border, can determine which version of history reaches which audience for 2 full generations. The reopening of the Karlshorst archives after 1990 also had a quieter, more academic legacy, one that rarely makes it into popular retellings but which historians consider genuinely significant. It allowed researchers, for the first time, to cross-reference Soviet, British, American, and German accounts of exactly what was said and done in that room on the night of the 8th and 9th of May, resolving long-standing confusions over timings, translations, and the precise sequence of events that earlier, single-sided accounts had left unclear. Discrepancies between the German and Russian language versions of the surrender document itself, and disputes over exactly when, in which time zone, the ceremony was formally concluded, could only be properly untangled once historians on both sides of the former divide were able to compare notes and footage directly, rather than relying on whichever fragmentary version their own national archives happened to hold. Surviving film and photographs from both ceremonies can today be viewed through the Imperial War Museum's collections in London, through the Bundesarchiv in Germany, and through the permanent exhibition at the Museum Berlin-Karlshorst itself, which has, since its post-reunification redesign, made a considerable effort to present both signings side by side with full historical context rather than the partisan framing either side favored during the Cold War. Visitors to Karlshorst today can stand in the very hall where Keitel signed, its long tables and chairs still arranged much as they were that night, with looped footage of the original ceremony now projected for anyone who climbs to the balcony overlooking the room, a small but telling detail. For decades, the room itself was easier to stand inside, for those permitted to travel there, than the film of what happened in it was to see. The original Rhin classroom likewise survives, preserved as the Musée de la Reddition, a modest, almost unassuming building that, fittingly, remains far less visited and far less well-known internationally than its grander Berlin counterpart, a final, quiet echo of the imbalance in fame and access that has shaped this story since the night it happened. Neither room, it is worth adding, looks today quite as it did in the newsreels of 1945. Both have been adjusted, restored, and in places rebuilt by the museums that now occupy them.